Hello and welcome to this 2024 update for SimpleBake. My intention in this video is to go over all the features of SimpleBake one by one, nice and slowly, just explain what everything does. The reason for that is that SimpleBake's obviously moved on quite a lot since I did the last one of these videos. I always have an intention of making a new one, but I can never seem to find the time. So I thought I'd take this time to sit down and just go over every feature, every option, try and explain what all of them does, how you would use them, so you can get a view as to how you might use SimpleBake in your workflow or for whatever you're doing. So I'm not going to use any complicated models. I'm just going to use nice simple cubes with materials, which will hopefully make it a lot easier to follow what I'm doing. I'll try and go through everything without leaving anything out. Inevitably, I will leave something out, but I will try not to. We'll start right at the beginning then with installing it. So I've got a pretty stock copy of Blender 4.2 installed. SimpleBake is not here, not yet. So in Blender 4.2 onwards, Blender's introduced this concept of extensions, which are, I think, going to gradually replace add-ons. For now, SimpleBake is what's being termed a legacy add-on, which isn't insulting at all. So what you have to do is you have to install it manually from disk. If you have used SimpleBake before, you know that it has an updating mechanism of its own. That's because I don't sometimes I publish quite a lot of new versions of SimpleBake in rapid succession, and having to go to Blender Market, both for me to upload each individual one and for you to download each individual one, is a bit of too much of a pain, really. So a number of years ago, I wrote a script that basically pulls the latest version from my website and installs it. And generally, people quite like that, I think, because I always want you to be using the latest version of SimpleBake. There is a facility that I'll talk about where you can roll back to the latest stable version of SimpleBake, just in case a bug has crept into the newest one and it's stopping you doing your work. But generally, I think you should always be using the latest version if you can. So what I'll do now is I'll show you how to install it on Blender 4.2. So you're going to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, not extensions, because again, it's not an extension yet. I will convert SimpleBake into an extension in the future. I think Blender Market have said they've got plans to implement a repository. So the big thing about extensions is that they're kind of always pulling the latest version online, basically a professional version of what I've been doing with SimpleBake for years. But they haven't done that yet with Blender Market. So when they do, I'll probably when they do rather, I think I'll convert SimpleBake into an extension and maybe use Blender Market's repository. I just want to see what it looks like first. But for now, it's an add-on. So what you need to do is you need to go to the add-ons here. You need to go to this little button up here, install from disk. And then what you'll have done is you'll have downloaded the zip file available from Blender Market. What I'm going to do is go to this directory where I have all the old versions of SimpleBake. And I'm going to deliberately install an older version. So the latest version is 1.4.2. I'm going to deliberately install 1.4.0. The reason for that is that, again, because it's a slight pain to constantly upload to Blender Market, the version on Blender Market I only update now and again. I kind of just rely on you being able to download a version there, auto update to the newest version, and away you go. So to simulate that, I'm going to deliberately install, let's say, SimpleBake 1.4.0. So there's a zip file like you would have downloaded from Blender Market. You click it, install from disk. I've got a little notification down here saying modules installed, and you see it appears in the list now. And then if we go over here, you can see SimpleBake is installed. So newer version of SimpleBake available. Please update automatically in add-on preferences. And this is where you'll go back to add-on preferences and you'll use that automatic update. So anytime there's an update for SimpleBake, if you come into the add-ons and go into the preferences like I've just done here, big red update button, click that, SimpleBake update complete, please restart Blender. So I'll just do that quickly. I'll kill Blender, bring it back. And there we go. SimpleBake is up to date, version 1.4.2 installed and ready to go. Okay, so the next thing I want to discuss is that preferences screen and the options that are there, because I think sometimes people miss these. So if I go back to add-ons, search for SimpleBake, and then I bring this up, you've got a number of different buttons. So because we're at the latest version, that big red update button isn't there. You can see the release notes, which will launch your browser. and you can get a feel for just kind of how often SimpleBake is updated here. I tried to put a little, probably less than professional sounding comment as to what exactly I'm doing when I upload a new version, so you can decide whether it's worth immediately updating or leaving it for a bit. You've got this option here to roll back to the previous version. To be honest, I should really say previous stable version. I kind of update the rollback version when I feel that it's been out for a while, people have been using it, no one's reported any bugs, it feels pretty stable. That's when I make that the new stable version. But in honesty, I'm trying to be bug free with the latest version in theory. It's just sometimes, as I say, if I publish a new version and there's some bug I've not spotted, you can always go back to the version that was last deemed stable. There's a support page, which again will just launch your browser to a basic support page. I think this takes you to this common baking issues page. This is really helpful. Well, people tell me this is really helpful. It sort of talks about the various things you can kind of run into, particularly for people who aren't familiar with baking at all, let alone with SimpleBake, or perhaps they aren't familiar with Blender. There's some warnings on here about Blender bugs that still exist years after being reported, which boggles the mind. But anyway, so you've got a lot of kind of tips there. There's a Discord page, which is where we kind of have a community of people sometimes that can help each other, particularly useful for things like people who want to use game engines. I have to put my hands up and confess, I have zero experience using game engines. I really have never developed a game or used Unity or Unreal. I just kind of do what people tell me they need SimpleBake to do. So if you need actual help with game engines, there are some people on there I think who probably know, well, do know a lot more than me. This is where you'd enter your Sketchfab API key. So SimpleBake does have an option to upload to Sketchfab. I'm not sure how many people use that anymore. It was kind of a defining feature of SimpleBake when I first brought it out. But I don't know, people really still. Anyway, if you were to use it, you put your API key in here, and then when you've created an object with SimpleBake, you have the option to upload it. I'll try and remember to cover that later in the video. Yeah. So here is where you have total control over how your bake textures are named. So I do know that certain game engines and certain studios have their own rules about how things are named. This allows you to change how all the textures get named when they're created. So you've got some variables here to play with: object name, a batch name, which is just a name you want to give a batch of bakes, which you can set over here on the panel under other settings. Oops, lost my window now. Bake mode, which is the mode in which you're baking. Bake type. Bake mode would be PBR or Cycles, which we'll get into in a minute. Bake type is the type of map you're baking, so diffuse, submission, metalness, whatever. Resolution, obviously the resolution. Frame, you can bake a number of different frames in SimpleBake if you've got animated textures, so that will include the frame number. It actually gets added anyway automatically if you turn on that option, because if it didn't, your textures would all have the same name and overwrite each other. But this allows you to control exactly where in the file name it's placed, so you can put it at the beginning, put it at the end, etc. Abbreviate resolution. I tried to do tooltips in SimpleBake rather to try and give you as much information as possible without having to look things up. So always hover over, see if the tooltip answers your question. But basically that does what it says. It's going to abbreviate resolutions like 2048 by 2048 to 2K, etc. Button to restore it to the default. It is the default, so it doesn't do anything, but just takes it back to that beginning. Here is where you control the aliases. So again, I know different studios and who use SimpleBake, and also different game engines require these things to be called different things. So diffuse can sometimes be called albedo, is it? Metalness might just be called metal instead of metalness, etc. So you can change the names of how SimpleBake names everything to do with those here. Here is where you set the color space. So in general, things like a metalness map and a subsurface scattering map would be non-color. Only really diffuse and emission, which are RGB maps, would be a different color space, but you can choose any of the ones available in Blender 4.0 for whatever you're up to. Same again for special maps. So SimpleBake, as we'll come on to, differentiates between the basic kind of PBR maps, and then it also bakes some ones that aren't sort of included in what you would think of as PBR, like ambient occlusion, curvature, thickness, etc. And it's the same options for those: name, color space, and a button to restore all that to the defaults. And then you've got these kind of tweaks and miscellaneous options. So if you don't want SimpleBake to check it's at the current version when you start Blender, you check that and it won't do. It won't access the internet. There's an option here to unpack node groups. Node groups are the bane of my life with SimpleBake, for technical reasons. I have to it's sort of a really convoluted way. I have to unpack node groups to be able to work out what channels need to be baking. So SimpleBake will SimpleBake will only unpack the node groups that actually matter. So it's hard to describe, but basically, if you're running into problems, this option someone requested will unpack every node group. It should never really be necessary, but it's there if you need it. Um, Again, SimpleBake will only bake PBR from materials that have nodes that are going to give you a PBR result. So if you're using a diffuse BSDF or a glossy BSDF, you can't really get PBR from those. Those aren't physically based shaders. And so SimpleBake will, if it detects one of those nodes that it can't use in your material, it will halt the bake and it won't let you proceed. However, sometimes if you buy kind of materials from Blender Market or somewhere else, they will be really convoluted and they might have some of those nodes in there, but they're not doing something or they're being converted back to RGB, and basically it just trips up SimpleBake because it thinks it can't work. This will skip the check. I don't recommend it because the whole reason that check's there is because if you bake with nodes that can't give PBR results, you're going to get nonsense. You're going to get color, you're going to get material, so you're going to get textures that don't look right. It could even crash because again, SimpleBake isn't expecting those nodes. But for at least a couple of users, this has come in clutch because it allows them to bake with materials that, in honesty, should be designed slightly better. But it just skipping that check means the bake can go ahead, and in those cases, it doesn't. It actually works out fine because the material is just built that way. SimpleBake does channel packing. There's two methods for it, neither of which are perfect. I'm working on a third method, which I hope will be perfect, but Blender is quite limited in what it offers you. The first version and the version SimpleBake used for years was to channel pack via the compositor. So it uses compositor nodes to create channels, and that mostly works. The new method is more complicated using I won't go into it, but like Python has a library called NumPy, I don't know how you pronounce it, and it's kind of using maths to fiddle with all the pixels. And again, that is probably better, but it's still not perfect in my opinion. I'm working on a third method that hopefully will come eventually that will be perfect. But for now, you can kind of switch between the new version, the new method and the old method and see what works best for you, depending on what you're doing and where you're using those textures. Disable auto smooth for custom split normals. So this doesn't really apply anymore because Blender, I might actually disable that option if we're running on Blender 4.2 because Blender 4.2 doesn't have auto smooth anymore. So you can just ignore that really. All PBR materials are baked at 2 samples. The reason is because behind the scenes, SimpleBake is running them through an emission shader, so sample count doesn't matter. I mean, in theory, it could be 1 sample and that should be sufficient. There's no lighting, there's no shadows, there's nothing to really cause noise. The exception to that is sometimes you can use nodes within your materials for if you use a bevel node is a good example, a bevel node. It can cause normal maps to look noisy. So SimpleBake deals with that automatically, but if you want real kind of peace of mind, you can just tell it, you can override this default behavior of baking. So by default, it will bake everything at 2 samples unless it detects a reason in the material to up it, and then it will up it to 100 samples. But here, if you want the real peace of mind, you could just put everything at 100 samples. It'll take slightly longer to bake everything, but it will guarantee no noise, even if you've got those weird occasions where you're using a node that might introduce it. You can change the location of SimpleBake rather, so you can display it on the render panel or the end panel. As I've said in this red warning, I think it crashes all the time when you have it on the M panel. I don't know why. It shouldn't. I'm looking for a reason why, but I can't find one. I actually like it on the M panel better, but it just Blender seems to crash way more often. I don't know why it does, but so the option is there. I don't recommend it until I've found out why the damn thing crashes all the time. And then this option is toggles and tick boxes. So for years of SimpleBake, it was just tick boxes because I never really bothered with what it looked like. I was more interested in how it worked. Some people love the tick boxes. I think I don't. I don't know. But I gave the option to change it to toggles in an attempt to make SimpleBake look bit more professional. But yeah, to each their own, I guess. You've got the option there to do whatever you want. And I think that's everything for the add-on preferences. Okay, let's talk about the first kind of choice you're faced with, PBR Bake or CyclesBake. I'll keep this one real simple. PBR Bake is baking PBR maps. So these record the properties of the material, so how much diffuse it has, how much metalness it has, how much the normal map that goes with it to show the normals of the material, how much transmission it has, etc. No lighting, no shadows. You're getting kind of the instructions for Blender or for Unity or Unreal or whatever, or Sketchfab. You're creating the instructions for how to reproduce how that material looks. That's how I'd encourage you to think about it. That's how I think about it. CyclesBake is the kind of traditional baking mode of Blender. You are baking the appearance of the material. So you're baking the appearance of the surface, including the lights, any shadows, any reflections. They're all kind of baked in as if you've taken a photograph of the surface. That's different, as I say, to PBR where you're recording the properties, and then wherever you're taking your textures, Sketchfab, Unreal, Unity, that's going to calculate the shadows and the reflections and all that stuff. Whereas CyclesBake, again, which is basically my name for the traditional baking modes in Blender, is baking them into it as if you've taken a picture. Hopefully that makes sense. That's how I think about it. Those are the two kind of fundamental modes in which SimpleBake operates. Okay, so we'll start with a section of the panel that's available in both PBR Bake and CyclesBake, and that's settings presets. So there's two types of presets in SimpleBake. I should say by preset I mean recording all your settings. So what objects you've got in your bake objects list, what maps you've got turned on, what ray distance you've got for baking to type. Everything gets written to the preset. You've got two types of presets, one global, and that's stored outside of your blend file in the file system, and one blend file presets, which, as you're going to guess, is stored in the blend file and is specific to that blend file. So if you open any blend file, you'll always see all your global presets, but the blend file presets are specific to that blend file. And all you do is you set your options on the panel as you want them. You give this a name, and then you click the little save icon and it saves it in the list. And that, again, that's created in the file system. You can see there it's in home, Lewis, file. Well, I'm on Linux and I'm using a Flatpak version, so that directory structure is a bit convoluted, but basically Blender config, it's one directory up from where SimpleBake itself lives, which seems to be where other add-ons store their data, so I thought I'd shamelessly copy them. So yeah, to load a preset, just select it, hit the little tick icon. To delete a preset, hit the little cross icon. It will refresh automatically, but you can manually refresh it there. As I say, presets include the bake objects in your bake list, and obviously for global presets, from file to file, those objects might not exist, but what SimpleBake will do is it will try to load them if they are there. So it won't be a problem if they're not there. But also, you can also turn this off, so it will load every setting, but the bake objects will stay the same. So if I demonstrate that by saying, let's remove it. So we've actually got an empty bake objects list. Let's turn this off and load it. See, it's loaded all the settings, but it hasn't put the cube back in the bake objects list. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not going to go over this because it's exactly the same buttons. You obviously don't need this option for the blend file presets, but it's the same concept, and those are saved with your blend file. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is also available in both PBR Bake and CyclesBake, and that's the Bake Objects section of the panel. This, unless you enable Bake to Target, is really simple. You just add the objects you want to bake to the list. It's smart enough that it won't add anything other than mesh objects, but any mesh objects you want to bake go on the list. You can move them up and down. In honesty, there's not a lot of point to that. It just changes the order in which they're baked, and maybe just for convenience sake, for you looking at the list, if you've got a long list, you might want to position certain ones at the top, certain ones at the bottom, but in honesty, it doesn't make that much of a difference. You can clear the list, you can refresh the list. The reason for that is that if you say add an object, maybe remove it from your scene, SimpleBake doesn't know it's gone. Now it will refresh the list itself when you try to bake, so it'll never try to do anything that's impossible. But if you want to trigger a manual refresh, there's a button right there for it. I'm going to come back to Bake to Target and isolate objects because I think it's probably better to talk about those after we've discussed some of the other options. So moving on, staying in PBR mode, I'll go through everything in PBR mode and then I'll go to CyclesBake mode and try and just cover the bits that are different. So PBR Bake's selection panel is obviously specific to PBR, shockingly. Here you select the different types of map that you want to bake. You can select all, you can select none. A new button here exists that will try to guess the maps that your object is using. So let's just show how that works. I'm going to add this cube, cube.002, and I'm going to click this and it's picking up nothing. The reason it's picking up nothing is because I've changed nothing from the default settings of a Principled BSDF. If I'm going to plug something into it, what am I doing? Yeah, if I'm going to just plug something into it, it will detect that and it knows that I've changed that, and therefore it's highlighting that. It's selecting diffuse for your bake. Similarly, if I change the default settings, let's push the roughness up, hit the button again, it's detecting it. So this may seem a bit pointless if you're creating your own material, but if you've actually, let's say, purchased material, I had someone on Discord with this problem, and maybe it's a bunch of different shader nodes mixed together, maybe they're hidden inside node groups, and maybe some of them have input, some of them don't. I think it can become, my blender's frozen now because it's trying to recalculate the shader, but it can become really complicated to actually work out what your material is using. So that's why that button exists. And again, it's detected here just the ones you've changed. So even if you've got a node group like this, where all the Principled BSDF sockets are plugged into the node group, it should still detect them. So I'll just push transmission weight up a bit, and yeah, it's detected that transmission has been changed. So handy little button there. And again, it will help, I think, a lot with the case where you, like say, if you've purchased some node groups or something like that, or sorry, purchase some materials and it's full of node groups and you don't quite know what channels are being used, that should automatically detect it. So I'm just going to reset the settings on this file so don't confuse us. There's a few extra options that appear. You can see when I've selected diffuse, I now have this option, but it's grayed out, and the tip explains why. Extra options are not available because you are not exporting your bakes. So certain things require, the technical reason is I can only do certain things if the file exists outside of Blender, because again, Blender is quite limited in what you can do internally. Once it's outside of Blender, I can do fancier stuff, especially with UDIMs. UDIMs are another pain in the ass when it comes to SimpleBake because Blender kind of handles UDIMs and kind of doesn't. I think every version of Blender it gets a bit better, but it's still kind of not there with UDIMs, in my opinion. You can't kind of access the data properly from a scripting point of view. So certain things have to go outside of Blender for them to work. So I'll just turn that on quickly. We'll come back and talk about this, obviously. And now I've got access to this option. So I can have diffuse, or I can have diffuse with AO. And again, skipping ahead slightly, you'll see that it's turned on AO. And I can't turn it off because I need it for this option. There's a couple of other options. So if I turn on normal map, it's going to give me a choice between an OpenGL and DirectX normal map. Blender uses OpenGL. But certain game engines are expecting DirectX. It's just a different way of formatting normal maps, so you can choose between them. Similarly, if I turn on roughness, I get the option to switch between rough and glossy. These are kind of an invert of each other, but again, certain applications, game engines, Sketchfab, whatever, they might be expecting roughness, they might be expecting glossy. Blender deals in roughness, which you see from the principal BSDF. Blender deals in roughness, but a glossy is an inverted version of a roughness map, so it just saves a bit of time there. I think that's all of them. Just trying to remind myself. Yeah, those are the three kind of extra options, depending on what you've got selected. If you're wondering what this button is, this is actually for transmission roughness. It still exists because SimpleBake is still compatible with older versions of Blender, but there is no transmission roughness in Blender 4.0 and above, I think. So that's why that doesn't exist. So I think that's everything. I'll just show quickly what I mean about maybe a new file. I'll just show quickly what I mean about the AO. So if I create a file here, and this is not professional, but if I just create a bit of a feature in it there. So if I just bake the diffuse, it will all just be gray. So I'll go here to look at the output. Yeah, just gray. If I mix it with AO, okay, so again, I've got to save my file so that I can export my bakes. So I will mix that with AO, 50%, let's say, and we'll bake. I get my ambient occlusion. I get my diffuse. But you can see this time it's been multiplied with the AO. So I've actually got the ambient occlusion map on its own because I needed that, but my diffuse map has AO mixed into it. And that's about it for that section of the panel, so we'll move on. Next section of the panel we'll talk about is these special bakes. So I couldn't think of a better name for these. When I first started making SimpleBake, I was going to go with like a baking theme and like specials in a restaurant. I can't remember. It was utterly stupid. But anyway, the name has stayed. So these are types of bake that aren't like aren't your standard sort of PBR. So curvature, ambient occlusion, light map, thickness, vertex color. If you don't know what these are, you're probably best Googling them. I won't go into the details of kind of what the different ones are. The only thing I will say, you see I can't deselect ambient occlusion because we've told it we want diffuse and AO. The only thing I will say is that these maps, ambient occlusion, curvature, thickness, I think light map. Yeah, I think light map. These are using SimpleBake's own materials. So when you bake these maps, SimpleBake will import a material that does that, it creates this effect, and bake that material. Now, if you are very picky about what these things look like, you can change those materials. So there's a button here, Import Specials Materials for Editing. So if I click that, and then I go, for example, let's just create a dummy object for a second. And then if I put a material on it, you see I've got the SimpleBake ambient occlusion map, curvature map, light map, and thickness map. Oh, sorry, materials. What am I talking about? Ambient, so those are materials. So if I go over to shading, yeah, so I can then edit them if I want. And you'll see they're not that complicated. So the ambient occlusion is literally just an AO node. Curvature is a bit more complicated, but still not really complicated. Thickness is quite complicated. And which one haven't we done? Light map is literally just a diffuse with so you can capture the light falling on the object. But if you edit those and save your blend file, they will continue to apply for that blend file. So those materials now exist in my blend file. SimpleBake won't import them again. It will use the ones that are already there, and that's why that button exists. So color ID, I'll just briefly mention, it will create a random color for each material on your object. So if you've ever used Substance Painter, you know that it relies or can rely on like color ID maps so that you can mask certain things and paint only on certain areas. If you bake a color ID map with SimpleBake, that's exactly what it'll do. So if I was to change one of these materials, let's give this object, sorry, yeah. So I'll give this face is the only one selected. I'll assign that a new material. And then if we bake this object, color ID map, see it gives, you can see in the bottom left there, it gives each material a different color. So that's what color ID does. Vertex color is vertex colors. Again, if you don't know what that is, it's a way of painting the vertices. You're probably best Googling it. Just looking at some of the extra options that become available. So curvature doesn't have any apart from to import the material that it uses, like we've already talked about. Thickness has, as you'll have seen when we look to the material, there's an AO node in there. And if you've got an AO node, sample count becomes relevant. So you can set the sample count to more or less if you want better results. Ambient occlusion similarly has that sample count. Light map, it really needs a sample count because as you saw, light map is just a diffuse node. Light map is actually pretty much just CyclesBake, the traditional way of baking in Blender. It's taking into account shadow and lighting, obviously, because that's the whole point of why it exists. So then you really do need a sample count, and that's just the same kind of sample count you'd use when rendering in CyclesBake or just rendering a scene through the camera as you would normally. You have this option here to apply color management to your light map. So when the light map gets saved externally, it can either ignore the color management or it can apply the color management. Where is it these days? Can't remember. Blender has a section somewhere for color management. I'm struggling to find. Oh, there you go, down there. So it's in the render panel. So you can either apply that color management to the exported texture or you can send it out without the color management. So there's two options there. Then we get into denoise. So denoise, again, if you don't quite understand the concept at all, you can Google it. But effectively, when you're talking about textures like light map, remember I said light map is basically just like baking CyclesBake or baking, or rendering generally. You get noise because you're trying to bake, you're trying to take into account lighting and shadows and things causes noise in the texture, and the more samples you give it, the less noise you'll get. But then you can use a post-processing filter at the end to kind of cheat and get rid of even more of the noise, so you can get away with fewer samples, quicker bake time, and then a clever algorithm to tidy it up. Blender does this automatically, which is why this is kind of selected anyway. Anything you bake in Blender, anything you render in Blender, I think, gets run through the kind of default cycles denoiser. And these are just the default options, the same ones you will find up here somewhere. Advanced? Ooh. Yeah, so I paused the video there for a second so you didn't have to suffer through me stupidly clicking around the panel, but my mistake was I was set to Eevee. So Blender does all kind of baking in cycles, and SimpleBake switches the cycles and then back to Eevee if you were in Eevee seamlessly behind the scenes, but it's always cycles. And Eevee doesn't really have the same kind of concepts, but in cycles, when you're talking about noise and when you're rendering in Cycles, you are firing rays at an object and looking for light sources, and it gives you noise. And anyway, my point is, Blender has a kind of default option for denoising, and you'll notice those options are exactly the same as you are offered down on the SimpleBake panel for the textures you are baking. An additional option, now you probably don't really want to have these both on at the same time, but an additional option is to turn off the default denoising and run it through the compositor. Why might you want to do that? Because the compositor has its own, I'll just turn this on a second. The compositor has its own denoise node. So it, again, if you don't know what the compositor is, you might Google it. But why would you want to run it through the compositor when Cycles Blender has its own default denoising? And the reason, mainly these days, is because if I go back to SimpleBake's support page, which is basically a list of issues, it's things like this bug where you'd see dark edges along the lines of your UV islands. Now this, let's check if it still exists. Yeah, it's still open. It's 3 years old. And that is an issue with the Cycles denoiser. So you can see here I talk about enabling the compositor denoiser instead to perhaps get a result, because I don't think that suffers from the same weird bug. But you wouldn't typically have both turned on, but you've got the option for one or both of them if you need it. Tip here explains why sample counts are relevant, basically what I rambled on about just a few minutes ago. And we've already discussed the import button. So I think that's everything on that section of the panel. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the texture settings section of the panel. And this is exactly what you might think it is. You set the texture resolution you want to bake at, and you can also set a different output resolution. So why might you want to set a different output resolution? The most common use case is to bake at a higher resolution, say 4K, and then output at a lower resolution. And doing this, you get what I call kind of a poor man's anti-aliasing. So there's no real anti-aliasing option in Blender when you're baking textures. So it's not something I can kind of just do automatically. The only real way to do it is to bake at a higher resolution and then scale down. And the act of scaling down gives you an anti-aliasing type effect. So it'll get rid of some of those jagged edges. It will just look better. But experiment, and you'll see what's best. Bake margin refers to how much the bake extends beyond the boundaries of the UV island. So if I just clear all images and let's bake again. So we're going to get a diffuse, let's just stick with diffuse on its own. So I'll just quickly bake a diffuse map from that cube we've got there. And if I go over to check that out, you can see that the bake extends beyond the boundaries of my UVs. Now you don't want it to do that too much, because if I haven't got any here, but if I had other objects or other islands from this object, then eventually they bleed into each other and it would be a mess. So you don't want it to be too much, but you also don't want it to be too little, because if you are right on the boundary of your UV islands, it can clip it, and then when the texture is displayed, wherever you're displaying it, in a game engine or Sketchfab or whatever, or Blender, you'll have a little gap and a little patch of black where it doesn't, where the texture doesn't quite cover the UV island. So SimpleBake does its best to give you an appropriate bake margin based on your text resolution. You can see that it's changing along there. You may have to experiment in some cases, but it does a first guess at what seems appropriate. Margin type, you can't really see it here, but there are different ways of generating what this margin looks like. So it's either based on extending, which I think is where it takes the very last pixel and just at the edge of the island and just extends it out for the margin. And adjacent faces, I think, where it does something more clever, where it tries to replicate the appearance. I don't really know what's better, but Blender offers both options, so SimpleBake offers both options. These options control this one controls the quality of the image. So when you create a new image in Blender, you have this option to create it just as default or as a 32-bit float image. A 32-bit float image contains more data. So you can see that option was turned off when I did this bake. So this image you can see here, sRGB 8A8 RGB byte image. That's kind of the default. If I turn this on and I bake again, you can see that the image it's created this time is an RGBA 16F, which is a 16-bit float. The time this is really important is here for normal maps. And that's why SimpleBake will automatically create all normal maps as 16-bit float images. You can disable that behavior down in other settings. This is called don't force high bit depth normal maps. So if you turn that on, it will just treat it like any other texture. But by default, SimpleBake will create normal maps as 16-bit float, and then this option will create everything as 16-bit float. It shouldn't matter too much for textures that aren't normal maps, but if you really want to make sure you're capturing all the detail, you can turn that on, and internally within Blender, everything will be created as 32-bit float. You've got to keep in mind that if you're exporting your bakes, which we haven't come to yet, then that changes the equation again, because you can create it as a 16-bit float in Blender, but if you export it as a JPEG, you're going to lose all the detail regardless of what it was created as internally. So this is all internal images 32-bit float. Keep in mind that your export settings, if you are exporting your bakes, are also going to affect your image quality. Transparent background is exactly what it sounds like for various reasons. Oh, this, by the way, this rendering issue, I don't know what causes this, but if you just kind of click these, it'll reset, but Blender seems to screw up sometimes when it's rendering. Just something to look out for. One of the fun joys of using Blender. So that's exactly what it sounds like. So if I bake with the transparent background option turned on, you can see that instead of a black background, it's a transparent background. There's various reasons you might want that, but it depends on what you're doing with the textures afterwards. Multiple objects to one texture set is probably one of the most important options on here. So very briefly, I've got my two cubes here. So let's add them both. Let's say we want them both to be baked to the same texture set. And what this means is it's going to take both those cubes. There's an option to automatically deal with UVs, but to avoid us having to talk about that before we're ready, I'm just going to manually create a UV map for both of them. See, I've got them both selected in edit mode, and I'm going to space them apart. So each of them now has a UV map that if you combine the UV maps, they don't overlap. So they've still got separate UV maps, but when looking at them together, they don't overlap, if that makes sense. So now, multiple objects to one texture set, I'm going to bake, what are we baking? Just diffuse, and it will create, what's the message? Diffuse in material light map. Okay, so one of the materials I had applied from one of the previous tests isn't PBR compatible, so it's warning me that this material here, if you watch the special bake section yet, you'll know that I put a material on that cube so I could show you, but that's not a PBR compatible shader, as we talked about in one of the earlier bits of this video. So SimpleBake doesn't let me bake. So I'm going to change that material now. Let's get rid of that. It doesn't really matter what we put on here, but as long as it's a PBR material, which that is, so is that, so is that, so we should be good to go. Let's go back to this view so we can look at the texture that's coming back. And let's bake. And it takes a little longer because you have to send, in Blender it only lets you send one object to the bake engine at a time. But see here, it's created one diffuse. It's called merged bake because that I didn't change the default name, but you can call it whatever. Obviously, when you're baking a single object on its own, the textures all have the name of the object in there. When you're baking multiple objects, you have to give it a name because how does it know which one you want? So merge bake, and it's created one diffuse map for both of them. That's from the previous bake, so ignore that one. and they don't overlap because we manually prepared the UVs. And it will create one for every map you've selected. So this is our merge bake, bake one PBR diffuse, metalness, normal, transmission, all of them. So that's probably one of the most important options because that quite often people want to do that. They want to bake multiple objects, but just a one set of textures. If you're not going to have SimpleBake deal with the UVs, you have to manually make sure they don't overlap like you just saw me do. Okay, let's keep going. So we've talked about texture settings. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset all the settings just so we know we know what we're doing. So now we're going to talk about export settings. So let's start with a simple bake, no pun intended. I will add just the one object, diffuse, and then again with this weird rendering bug, which I think is Blender rather than SimpleBake, but if I find a reason for it, I will fix it. It just seems to not want to render the panel. There we go. Usually clicking off and clicking back on will kind of force it to refresh. So I don't want all of them. I just want diffuse. No special bakes. This is the way to use SimpleBake, by the way. Just start at the top panel and then kind of work your way down. No special bakes. Texture settings 1024. 1024 is fine. Don't care about any of those options on this occasion. And let's say we're going to export our bakes. So the first thing we need to do is specify where we're going to export them. So this button will basically change it to default to be a directory called SimpleBake_bakes in the same place that your blend file is saved. So in this case, it's home Lewis untitled. So this will just be created in my Linux home directory. But I can change that. I can go in here and I can change it to whatever I want. So I could create it directly in my home directory. I could go into my desktop, etc. But let's keep it as the default. Blender's I don't know what the word is. The way Blender denotes where your blend file is saved is // So // means where my blend file is saved, and then followed by the directory you want your bakes to be in, if that makes any sense. So we won't use these options for now. I'm just going to bake this quickly. You see it's still using the UV map I used when I was moving the UVs about, and I'm going to quickly bring up my home directory, which is an absolute mess actually. Here's the SimpleBake bakes. I've still got bakes from the last time I was messing around with this, but the one that was created just now is here, and it's saved here as a PNG, just like we wanted. Subfolder per object is when you are baking more than one object, and I think you can probably guess how this is going to work. So I'll turn that on. I will, God, that is really getting annoying, isn't it? I will bake again. And then let's go back here. And you can see that's from the previous bake, but it's created these two folders and puts the textures in there. So this can be quite handy if you're baking a lot of different objects, maybe a lot of different maps, and you want them all to be divided up into folders for each object. It's just an organizational thing, basically. Export diffuse with color management settings. I think we've talked about that when we were talking about, where were we talking about that? Was it under special bakes? Oh, it's when we were talking about light maps, and it's this option, wasn't it? Apply color management to the light map. So that's when it's created within Blender. This is saying if your diffuse map, whether you want to export it with those color management settings that we already talked about. So Blender's color management settings. You won't want to do that a lot, I don't think. But sometimes if you've got your material looking exactly how you want it, and some of that is dependent on the color management settings you're using, you might want to export it with color management settings. But I mean, typically I don't use that. All export 16-bit. So this is where things get even more confusing. Remember this option, the create everything. Oh my God, create everything internally with 32-bit. So again, when I talked about that, I was saying that what you create the textures at internally in Blender can be affected by what they're exported as. When you're exporting, if you're using PNG as your format, 16-bit is the maximum you can achieve. If you switch to EXR, you can actually, it doesn't even give you the option because it is just the default. You will export at 32-bit image files, but 16-bit is the maximum for PNG. This option exists because if you turned it off, again, going back to what we were discussing earlier, only normal maps. So it explains it in the tooltip. Normal maps are always exported as 16-bit, but this option causes all images to be exported as 16-bit. I would recommend keeping that turned on because 8-bit PNGs don't always look great. The only reason it's there as an option to turn on and off is that some people are using textures that they've baked in applications. I think Second Life is one of them. There's something people have told me about that it will only accept 8-bit textures, so they literally have no choice. So if you want to just export things as a measly 8-bit, you can turn this off. And if you really want even your normal maps to be low quality, remember we discussed this option to not force high-bit normal apps down here. But for most users, most of the time, I would say just keep that turned on, and you'll always be getting the maximum quality you can. There's different options for different types of export. So JPEG has this quality slider because it's a lossy compression format. TIFF is similar to PNG, where you've got the option for 16-bit. TGA has no options. TGA RAW, again, you're talking about 16-bit or not 16-bit. So a kind of design philosophy of SimpleBake is you see the options that are relevant and you don't see the options that aren't. So that's why that exists. If you don't know what it does, or if you don't really know what you want, recommend keeping it turned on. And keep internal images after export is exactly what it sounds like. So you see me bake and then look in the file system at the images that it has generated, but those images also exist inside of Blender. If you really don't want them to, those images can be taken away. If you're using the images, if you're asking SimpleBake to use the images in Blender afterwards, so we've not talked about it yet, well, there's this copy objects and apply bakes option. You can't disable that. Well, you can't, if you disable this, you can't enable that because SimpleBake needs those images in Blender to be able to create the material for your copy objects and apply bakes option. But if you don't need them and all you care about is saving the images externally, you might not want to keep them internally. So that's why that's there. Similar to export bakes, you can also export the mesh. And here it's a choice between FBX and GLTF. So FBX comes with these options of apply object modifiers before export or apply transformation. These are basic options. If you really want to get into it, you can choose one of your presets. If you don't know how to create a preset, it's not a SimpleBake thing, it's a Blender thing. But if you're going into like exporting, like I am here, you can create a preset with the options that you want and save it. And then once you've created that preset will appear in this list for you to select, and then SimpleBake will just use that as its preset. Sorry, it will use that as the settings to export. So that's probably the advanced users option. If you don't have to specify a preset, it will just export it to FBX. What it will export is, in fact, I'll show you. So let's just take this object, for example. Maybe give it something more interesting as a texture so we can see it. Oh, maybe that object. I don't know why I've edited the wrong object there, but okay. I was editing the material that was only on one face, wasn't I? And this one's got it on all the faces. So that's fine. So we'll take this. We will, let's refresh our list. So we've only got one cube. Turn this off. We only want diffuse. No special bakes. Textures are okay at that resolution. I'm going to export bakes and export mesh, and then let's bake. So that's finished. And then if I go over to my external file system, so That was from before. This is the only object we've baked. You see I've got an FBX file here. And if I import that FBX file, let's save my scene and start a new one. And then I'm going to, let's clear everything from this scene and let's just import that FBX. And then it should come, if Blender's doing its job, with a material that correctly refers to the texture that only exists outside of Blender, the texture we saved externally. So you can see that here, that it's located in that directory. It's external, and yeah, so the FBX file, what I'm trying to say is the FBX file gets exported with ignore my Alexa. The FBX file gets exported with a reference to the texture as saved in this directory here with it. There we go. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about probably one of the most complicated bits, which is UV maps. So when you're baking, as explained on the baking support common questions page, so again, if you go back to SimpleBake and click to load the support page, there's a whole section here on it's almost always an issue of your UV maps. So many people contact me about problems with SimpleBake, and quite often that turns out to be a UV map that just isn't suitable for baking. So for good results when baking, you need a nice clean UV map. Every point on your surface of your model needs to have a unique point in UV space. So if you remember before when we were baking those 2 cubes to 1 map, I went to pains to make sure that the UVs didn't overlap. I'm not doing it right here. Yeah, didn't overlap, because if they did, then the bakes would be on top of each other. But the same goes if you're just baking one model. You need to make sure that you've got a nice clean UV map. What I quite often see is someone or some people who have UV unwrapped quite a complicated model, and they've got thousands and thousands of tiny little islands. And every one of those islands, if you remember when we talked about the bake margin setting, every one of those islands will have a margin. And there comes a point when you've just got so many islands that no matter how big your bake textures are, so you can put your texture resolution up to 8K, 10K, you're going to run out of room. It's just not going to work. You need a really clean UV map. And in honesty, the best way to do that is to manually unwrap your model. I mean, it's not fun. There are lots of tutorials online about how to do that properly, but you will always get the best result by manually unwrapping your model. That said, SimpleBake does have a number of options for generating and manipulating UV maps, so we'll talk about them now. So if I select at least one object for bake, it's telling me here that I've not got anything in my bake objects list, so let's add one. Not that one. Tell you what, let's just start again with a nice clean cube. There we go. So I'm going to create a new UV map for that cube. Don't really need to, because by default Blender gives you a good UV map, but for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to tell it to create a new UV map for that cube, and I'm going to bake. And there you can see it's no longer that T shape. It's created a new, well, the UV map, because we have this option enabled, restore original UVs, after the bake, SimpleBake has restored this T-shaped UV map that Blender gave us by default. But if you go into the data section and then UV maps, you can see that it's actually baked to a UV map that it's UV unwrapped with Smart UV Project. And all that's done is it's called Blender's standard Smart UV Project, which you will get if you're in the UV editing space and you hit U, one of the options. This is what SimpleBake has done, but it's not bothered to bring up the dialog for you. It's just kind of done it with its own settings, and you can set the margin. So each one of these things that's unwrapped is a UV island, unlike the T shape that it gives you. These are all, it's basically taken every face and made it into an island, because that's how Smart UV Project works. This gives you the spacing between them. And that's basically it. So if this didn't have a good UV map, sometimes you can get a really good result from Smart UV Project, and by just enabling this, you'll get a great result. Most of the time you won't, in honesty, especially if it's an organic model. Again, you're better manually unwrapping, but if you want a quick and dirty solution, it's there. If I was baking more than one object, so let's add 2 objects to my bake objects list. Let's say I was using this object, multiple objects to one texture set. So the first thing to notice that if I select 2 objects and I have multiple objects to one texture set turned on, SimpleBake is warning me. First of all, it's saying that, well, this is just for information. So by default, we're going to detect UDIM tiles. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's also warning me here saying you're baking multiple objects to one texture set with existing UVs because we've turned off new UVs. You need to make sure they manually don't overlap. And that's what you saw me doing earlier in the video where I dragged the 2 UVs off the top of each other to show you how to use the multiple objects to one texture set option. If I do it now, this will just bake 2 objects on top of each other because both of these objects have their UVs in exactly the same position. So you can do a number of different things here. So if I enable new UV maps, first thing to note is that warning's gone away. But there are different ways of generating a UV map. So Smart UV Project Individual is the same as the option we saw for one object. So it will just Smart UV Project this object, then Smart UV Project this object, and again, because they're exactly the same object, the UVs will be on top of each other, and so you see current settings will unwrap objects individually, but baked to one texture set. Bakes will be on top of each other. You don't really ever want to do this. It's just there in case you really, really know what you're doing. Smart UV Project Atlas is a better option. So what this will do is select both objects and it will UV unwrap them, and effectively what you'll get is this. So it'll Smart UV project both of them, but because you're doing them both at once, Blender is smart enough to make sure the islands don't overlap. So that's what that option will do, Smart UV project to an Atlas. Atlas, by the way, is what people call a UV map that spans multiple objects. So again, these objects have their own individual UV map. You can see this one is this, I don't know, 7 shape, and oops, this one is here because that's just how Blender's arranged them. And when you view them both at the same time, you would call that like an atlas map because it's the UVs of multiple objects at the same time. So this object will Smart UV project our 2 bake objects into an atlas map. This option will take whatever they've got as their active UVs, and it will, instead of creating new UVs, it will just rearrange them so they fit. So the best way to illustrate this is actually to get rid of our cubes. Let's go back to 2 fresh cubes, and these both have the UV map Blender gives them by default, this T shape. So if I was to UV unwrap them, we'd get the individual squares again, detached from each other. But I'm going to have this combine UVs by Atlas option. Unbelievably annoying. And then I'm going to bake, let's add 2 bake objects to the list. So we're actually baking something. Combine UVs by Atlas, yep. And you see what it's done now, or what it hasn't done now because I didn't turn on the option I wanted. So new UV maps combine by Atlas. There we go. So you see how it's taken the 2 individual UV maps, these T-shapes, and it's actually combined them. Again, because we've got this option enabled to restore, where are we? Restore original UV maps, you can see that it's actually restored the UVs they had before. But if I switch them both back to SimpleBake, you can see that they're 2 T's and it's rearranged them but not split the island. So it's not created a new UV islands, it's just rearranged the UV islands that were already there. Hopefully that makes sense. With this arranging of the UV islands comes a bunch of options. And these are really the same options you will see if you go to the UV editor and pack the existing islands. You see you get these options about how they're packed. So these are the same options you get here. So it can scale them, rotate them. So if one of them was massive and one of them was smaller, and I have this option to scale them, it would scale them so that they fit, and average will actually average them so that one isn't disproportionately larger than the other. So they will maintain the same kind of relevant proportions, if you see what I mean. So you've got all these options, and these are all only appear when you're using this option, because that's where you're shuffling existing UVs about. If you're projecting them into a new atlas, you're creating new UVs, new UV islands completely. So you don't get those options available. So there's a couple of other options here. So correct aspects. So again, that is an option you get when you're UV unwrapping something in Blender. You're best Googling it if you don't quite understand what it means. But if you are, if you smart UV project, where is it? Yeah, correct aspect is one of the options. So if your UVs look skewed, it's because the aspect is being corrected when you don't want it to be. So you can turn that off and on. Again, you're best Googling that. Someone can probably explain it better than I can. Move new UVs to top. That's a tongue twister. Again, you've seen how SimpleBake creates a new UV map when you use certain options. Sometimes, for reasons that people have explained to me and I honestly have forgotten, it's preferable to have that new UV map at the top of your list, perhaps to work better with other add-ons. I can't remember the reason why someone wanted that, but that's why that option exists, because some people, I think, find that useful. And then the last thing to mention is UDIMs. There's no automatic way to there's no automatic way to create UDIMs. So what you have is the ability to detect them if you've already created them. So UDIMs are a whole topic in themselves. I think I've said earlier in this video that Blender sort of supports them and it's getting better, but I don't think it really does support them properly yet. But the way you would use them at the moment is if I go into the UV editing space, I create a new image and I tell it I want tiled. Now I'm not actually going to use this image. This is more just so I can see where I want to position my islands. But I'm going to create one here, maybe add a couple of tiles to it. And then I'll position that's way too many tiles, I don't know why I did that. And then I'll position my islands where I want them. So maybe I want, I don't know, maybe these faces have a ton of detail on them. I want them on their own UDIM and I want them to be massive. Maybe this one's got loads of detail and I basically want it to have a tile to itself. And then maybe these are just kind of average. Let's go to that last tile. So that's how you kind of set up your UDIMs. Again, this image I've created isn't actually going to be used. What's going to happen is SimpleBake is going to detect that you've used UDIMs and it's going to bake to those UDIM tiles. So you get told about that here. UDIM tiles are detected when UVs. So I'm going to turn that off because we've only got one object. UDIM tiles are detected when UVs extend beyond the standard UV space. So the standard UV space is basically this first tile. Objects without UDIM tiles can be baked together. So again, if you were using this multiple objects option, let's say this cube had UDIMs, this cube doesn't, you can bake them together just fine, but you'll get UDIM tiles for all of them because it needs 3 UDIM tiles for this cube, so this cube will get 3 UDIM tiles, although 2 of them are going to be blank because it only exists in that first tile. Is there anything else to mention? Don't think so. So I'll show you that quickly. So what are we baking? We're just baking cube 3, which is a UDIM thing, the way we just did it. We're not exporting, so I'm going to bake it. And there you can see that it's automatically detected UDIM tiles. That texture I used to position the UDIM tiles still exists, but we don't need it. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's also the wrong one. That's the wrong one. That's the right one. There we go. All those were textures from previous bakes. So they have kind of the UDIMs. If you want to see what that looks like in the external file system, we can turn on, okay, I've not saved my blend file, so let's save my blend file here. I'm going to export those bakes again with the stupid rendering problem. And then I'm going to bring us over to the output folder. So this is the folder in my external file system. UDIMs exist externally from Blender as these files, this .1001, which is the first tile, second tile, third tile, and then another application, another application like a game engine or Sketchfab. Well, Sketchfab doesn't support UDIMs, that's a bad example. Another application like another 3D modeling program or a game engine should recognize this format as UDIMs, and that's basically how UDIMs work. Hopefully the support in Blender will get better, but for now it's that kind of create a dummy image, place the UDIMs. There's no automatic way to create UDIMs. You've got to do it yourself. Yeah, and I think that's about it actually for the UV channel. Maybe it's not a panel section of the panel. Maybe it's not as complicated as I feared. Onwards to the next one. So I'm recording this later because I've just realized there's something I missed when I went over the UV settings, and it's this option here, prefer existing UVs called SimpleBake. And I just want to illustrate that really quickly. So I've got an object here and I've got a UV map, the default one that Blender gives me, and it's this T shape. What I can do, what you sometimes do is you have your material and you actually explicitly refer to the UV maps you want to use when you're, I don't know, displaying different kinds of textures. So I don't know, something like that maybe. Yeah, so you see now this UV map is driving the appearance of my procedural texture, which isn't usually the case. Procedural textures usually use an automatically generated coordinates, but I've explicitly told it to use that. But this might not be the UV map I want to bake to. So if you go back to this, I keep coming back to it, but this tips page for SimpleBake, one thing I talk about here is that it's best for good results. A good general tip is to create a separate UV map for baking. You can name that SimpleBake and use the option prefer existing UV maps called SimpleBake. And that's why this option exists, because you might have, your object might have loads of UV maps. You might have 2 or 3 different UV maps, and you might be using them in your materials to drive the appearance of your object, or you might just have a UV map like this, just one UV map. You might not even be using this node, but I'll keep it here because I have to, because otherwise this will default to generated coordinates instead of UV map. And if I want it to scale, I might do this. You cannot use this UV map for baking. A UV map for baking has to exist within the UV area, or if you're using UDIMs, it has to exist within the UV tiles. This is great for getting the appearance of your material, so I can get a nice tiling effect, but you can't bake to this because Blender only bakes within the UV space. It just won't look right anymore. A UV map for baking has to have nice clean islands for every point on your model. Every point of the surface has to have a space somewhere in this square. So you can't use this. So if I was using this, what I might do is I might say, okay, I've got that UV map. I've explicitly said here that's what's driving the appearance of this magic texture. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another UV map, and I'm going to call it SimpleBake, and it's not the active map, so this is the active map, obviously, for rendering, and we'll put it back on as active at the end. But I'm going to create this map, and this map is going to be my nice clean map for baking. And I'm just going to, I don't know, just to make sure we know what we're looking at, so it looks like that, so remember that shape. I'm going to put that back to the active UV map so that it's by default, and then I'm going to go here, I'm going to bake this object. I'm not going to generate new UV maps. I'm going to use the UV maps I've got, but I'm going to turn on this prefer existing UV maps called SimpleBake option. And just so we can see the results, I'm going to copy my object and I'm going to apply my bakes. So let's go with that. So you see, despite it having a different UV map that wouldn't work for baking active, the UV map that we've used for baking, which is the one, so this object is the object that SimpleBake's created, and SimpleBake creates that object, and the only UV map it uses is the one that it used for baking, so that your textures display correctly. So it doesn't care about the other UV maps, because once you're trying to just display your textures, the only UV map you give a damn about is the one you actually used when you baked the texture. So that's why this is the only UV map that exists. And you can see that it's that SimpleBake one. It's not that default cube one that goes outside the boundary. If we didn't use that option and we just let SimpleBake bake to this UV map, so it'll bake to this one because this is the active one highlighted. So I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to bake again. And you'll see that just looks completely wrong because you can't bake where your UVs extend beyond the UV boundary. It just isn't going to work. In fact, what it's done here, it thinks we're using UDIMs because it can see we left this option turned on, auto detect UDIMs. So that UV map we were using, it thought we were using UDIMs, and that's why it's kind of done this and why it looks terrible. That's obviously not what we intended. If I reset and I tell it not to detect UDIMs and I still don't turn this option on, so it's still going to try and bake to that UV map that extends outside the boundary. Let's see what we get. So again, this is what we get. You see it's missing a corner. It's not at the same scale. It's just, it doesn't bake correctly because you have to have a UV map that's inside the area. So that is a general kind of point to take away. You can have UV maps, use whatever UV maps you want, scale them, take them outside the UV boundary, whatever it takes to get your object looking like it should look. But when you're baking, your object absolutely has to have a UV map that is within this area, not overlapping either. So if I separate these islands, I can't have them overlapping because that's going to mess up. They can't overlap. Everything has to be clean, not overlapping within the boundary. And that's kind of why this option exists. So you have this ability to create a separate map just for baking. Okay, so now we're all the way down to other settings. So let's do this as quickly as possible. So batch name is as simple as it sounds. It's just a name that appears in your texture name. So here it's automatically set to like batch one, bake one rather, and that appears in the texture name. If you remember from when we were looking at the add-on preferences earlier in the video, you have this format string. Where are you? Oh, there you are, where you can control what's there. So if you don't want the batch name, you could take it out of your string, your format string. If you wanted it a different place in the texture name, you can move it around, but it's always just set on the panel here to whatever you want in this text. Image sequence is for when you are baking animated textures. So all this will do is bake, then it will advance the frame by one. Which button is that? You can tell I don't do any animation, can't you? Okay, here, there we go. So it will advance the frame by one, bake, advance the frame by one, bake, advance the frame by one, bake. So it'll just keep moving the frame and then baking. So that can be quite handy if you're doing that kind of thing. So let's see if we can show what it means. So I'll do frames. So it's off until you turn it on, and then let's do frames 1 to 3. Bake image sequence. The only one we had selected was diffuse, so what we should get is 3 diffuse textures. So 3 images baked for 3 frames, and you can see what we got here was diffuse.001, 0002, 0003, and those are the frame numbers. So that's what I think that first texture was from the previous bake we did in the last example. So what we got there was those 3 files for each of the frames, and that's all there is to that one really. It's just looping the baking process. Copy objects and apply bake. So this is another really important one. So if let's just make this more interesting, because why not? Shader a chance to compute. So let's bake this. We'll turn off image sequence and we'll copy objects and apply bakes. So I haven't really defined any of the other channels, but let's bake metalness, roughness, normal map, I don't know, alpha. It doesn't matter because I've not actually changed any of these in the material, but just to show you. So copy objects and apply bakes and hide source objects after bake. So now when I bake, it goes through the different maps, bakes them one by one until it's complete. And then you'll see it's hidden the object that we originally baked from and replaced it with this cube underscore baked in this SimpleBake underscore bakes group. And then if you go into that, you can see that it's created a material and it's plugged in each of the textures that we baked into that material. So this object is actually what gets sent external. If you remember from when we looked at the export mesh option, it basically creates this object and then exports it. So this is the object. You can see that's why when it comes back in, it knows the textures it was exported with, because Blender is clever enough to realize that when you're exporting something with a material like this, it writes a version of this material into the FBX file so that other applications and Blender itself recognize it when it comes back in. But if you're only interested in what happens in Blender, you'll see that basically if I unhide the original object, we've got this object. So this object is using the original material, and this object is using the textures that we've just baked. And that's what the copy object and apply bakes function does. And that works no matter what you're doing. So if you're baking multiple cubes, as you so often are, multiple objects to one texture set, it's fine with that as well. So it'll go through, it will bake all of those. I didn't turn on the UV option, so it's baking on top of each other, but I suppose it doesn't matter for this. It's doing exactly what I warned you about in one of the previous parts of this video. But you can see that they both share a material referring to this merged bake texture. So yeah, copy objects and apply bakes is exactly what it sounds like. It copies your objects and it applies your bakes. Create GLTF settings. So you'll only need to know about this if you're exporting to a GLTF file, which I have never actually used myself, but I think it's quite popular in web, like 3D rendering applications and things like that. So the way Blender does this is that you have a GLTF settings node file. So if I just bake one object to show you really quickly, why is this? You have selected AO, but you're not baking AO. So again, SimpleBake is always trying to tell you what you've not quite done right. So I'm going to put AO on there so I get an AO map as well. And then the object we get is here, and you'll see that it's created this GLTF group, this empty group. That's how Blender does it. And it's plugged it into the AO socket. So what happens then is when you export it to GLTF, Blender recognizes this node, recognizes that AO is the setting you want for the occlusion, and adds it in. Again, you won't really need to know about that unless you get into GLTF exporting, and then you'll probably know all about it yourself anyway. But that's why that option exists. Apply bakes to original objects. It can't coexist with copy objects and apply bakes, which is why that option disappears when you turn it on. But this again does what it sounds like. It will bake the object, but instead of creating a new object and applying that new material, it will apply that material to your original object. In honesty, this is quite dangerous. Not dangerous, but it's potentially confusing because it will replace the material in the original object. So if I show you that now, I'm baking cube.001. It'll go through the different maps I've asked for, and then cube.001 has the same material that I would have got for my copy and apply object, but applied back to the original object itself. The original material is still in Blender. SimpleBake marks it with a forced user so that it doesn't get accidentally erased, but it can be quite confusing, and this is why it comes with this little warning when you turn on this option that basically says, be careful when applying bakes to original objects. Original materials won't be deleted, but they will have no users and will be purged on next save. I don't think that's actually quite true. I think I changed it so it forces it, But I want people to be very careful with that option anyway, so I might change that message or not. And then this about restoring original UVs after bake, but you're applying bake textures. Again, we're applying our bake textures, but we're creating a new UV map, or we might be creating a new UV map. But um, if you're restoring your original UVs, then it won't display correctly because the texture that you bake has to be applied with the UV map that you use to bake it. So it's just a little warning there to make sure you actually kind of think about it and know what you're doing. But again, that option is kind of used with care. We've talked about don't force high bitrate normal maps. SimpleBake will normally up all the settings on normal maps to max. So internally there'll be 32-bit, going external like PNG, there'll be 16-bit, going external EXR, everything's 32-bit. But if you don't want it to behave like that and you want to treat normal maps like any other texture, turn on that option and it will just treat them like any other texture. This I mentioned ages and ages ago in the video. Surprised if full gold star if you remember. But back when we were talking about the user preferences, there's an option there for sample count for PBR baking. And I said that SimpleBake automatically boosts the sample count when it picks up a node in your material that needs it. So this is what that is. It's saying that if it detects an AO or bevel node, it boosts the sample count to 50 because despite the general rule that you don't care about sample count for PBR baking, you do care about it if there's a bevel node or an AO node. So that's why it boosts the sample count for those. And if you want it to be higher or lower, you can change it there. Finally, GPU versus CPU compute. I mean, that is what it is. You undoubtedly know what that means. It just allows you to select between the two of them. And that's that. Okay, and now we come to channel packing, which is one of the hardest things to demonstrate. So let's go simple. Let's start a new file. I'm just going to create a nice simple material. We'll use my favorite magic texture again to give it a bit of color. Maybe we'll plug in a noise texture into the roughness channel just so we can see it for illustration purposes. So that roughness texture looks like that. That magic texture looks like that, and we're plugging them both into the same material. So we're going to bake this object. 1K is fine. We don't want any special maps. We do need to. Do we need to export it? Can't remember my own rules. I think we do need to export it, so I'll export it into my directory into the default place again. Let's just clear that out so we know what we're looking at. And then we'll go all the way down to channel packing. So channel packing is every material has basically every texture, every file, every image file has like 4 channels: red, green, blue, alpha. Now, traditionally, they just store exactly what they sound like. The red channel stores the red information in your image, blue the blue, green the green, and alpha controls where it's transparent and where it's not transparent. And that's it. However, and this is not an area I'm an expert in at all, but in things like game engines where you're trying to minimize memory usage, it's handy not to have lots and lots of separate image files or texture files. It's handy to be able to kind of smuggle data in through the channels. So a really common one is this one, where let's say, well, you can give it a name, but we'll just keep the default for now. You can choose between PNG and TGA, but a really common one is to have your red information from diffuse, your green information from diffuse, your blue information from diffuse. So basically you're just getting diffuse, you're just getting what you see. But then in the alpha, you can only select the maps that you're baking. In the alpha, you hide the metalness. Hide's probably a bit strong. But so diffuse, 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 and then in alpha you hide the metalness. So I'm going to add that now. And then that's one of the the channel packed textures SimpleBake is going to create. So you can have as many as you want in this list, and you edit them just by clicking on them, and then when you're done, you save it. Make sure you save it. A big red, that you saw that big red button alerting you to the fact that you haven't actually committed your changes yet. So I'll show you what that means. If you remember what our material looks like, magic plugged in here. We do have a roughness texture. In fact, almost made a mistake there. Let's also plug that into metalness, because we're not actually using roughness, are we? We're using diffuse, 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 and metalness. So I'm going to bake that, and it will bake diffuse, it will bake roughness, and it will bake metalness. But then at the end, it will create a fourth texture, being the channel pack texture. Oh, we didn't select roughness, my mistake. So it bakes diffuse, metalness, and then this channel pack texture. Now, this just looks normal, but if you use this button to isolate the channels, you can see that the red is the red information from diffuse, the green is the green information from diffuse, and these are that magic texture. This is kind of why it exists, I think. It's a bit of a diagnostic tool. So you can see that's the blue information. And these are all black and white because they're effectively a binary map. Like where there's white, there's blue, and where there's black, there's no blue. That's what that's saying. So same for green, same for red. But then in the alpha, you'll see we got that noise texture. If you remember the noise texture we plugged in to the metalness, became our alpha channel of our pack texture. And that's how that worked. And the same thing gets sent to the external file system. So you can see here it exists here as cube underscore PBR pack texture. And if I open that in GIMP, which is probably the easiest way to see what we're talking about, again, it looks a bit garbled because it's not a usual way for GIMP to see an image. But then if I go to channels, I can isolate the red. And again, GIMP is still binary, but GIMP just displays red or black instead of white or black, I guess, to make it a little more obvious. There's the green information, blue information, and there's the alpha information, which is actually not really alpha information. It's this metalness, what we had for our metalness texture, hidden in the alpha channel of the texture. And hopefully that made sense, because I cannot explain it any better than that. Again, it is a thing for mainly, I think, game engines. It's a way to not have loads and loads of texture files. Because if you think about it, if I wasn't able to do that, I would need two textures. I'd need my diffuse texture, and I'd need a separate texture for my metalness map. This way, I get just one file. I wouldn't even use these in the game engine. I don't think I would hit the wrong button there. I would just use this. And so I can just have one file, and that's lower memory usage, and it's more efficient, and it's better, and everyone who uses a game engine loves it, and everyone who doesn't really understand it. And I kind of fall into the latter, although I kind of understand it because some very kind SimpleBake users have explained it to me. So that's kind of how that works. As I said, you can change between two different versions. I talked again right at the beginning of the video about there's an option in the preferences to enable the old version of channel packing. You won't see any difference on this panel except for the fact that you can select EXR. I can't get EXR to work with the new way of doing channel packing. I'm really hoping that third way of channel packing that I mentioned that I'm working on will just fix all the problems. But for now, it's PNG or TGA. It works perfectly fine. I just wish that I could do it in a better way, because this is kind of hacky. I'm kind of editing pixel by pixel, and I don't really like it. But it works. It does work. People use it. It's a useful feature. Delete bakes after channel pack. So this would just basically, if you don't want the diffuse and metalness texture on their own, and you're only interested in the pack texture. Similarly, on the export as well, you remember I said, oh, I wasn't going to even use the diffuse and metal, and I deleted them. Well, they wouldn't even be saved out if I had that option turned on. It would only be the channel pack texture, because that's all I'm interested in. And I'm pretty sure that covers it. Yeah, I think that covers it. I think that's it. Onwards to the next one. So next section of the panel is utilities. I've only very recently added this, so this is brand new to SimpleBake more or less. So there's just a bunch of kind of things I thought would be useful. So sometimes people change a lot of the settings and then they can't work out what they've changed that's kind of giving them the results they don't want, and they just want to go back to the start. And there wasn't an easy way to do that because SimpleBake saves all its settings into your blend file. So as soon as you open the blend file, your settings are back. And even if you uninstall SimpleBake and then download it again from Blender Market and then reinstall it, as soon as you enable it, all your settings are back because they're stored in the blend file. So unless you're going to create a new blend file, you can't get rid of them. This button just purges all the settings and you're back to completely to start. It purges all your blend file presets because they're stored within the blend file, but your global presets are okay because they're stored externally in the file system. So that's just something to keep in mind. Restore all materials. So if SimpleBake crashes, because if there's a bug or something, and it does happen from time to time, then sometimes what SimpleBake's doing with your materials, because it obviously needs to mess around with your materials quite a lot to achieve baking, especially for PBR, it's moving nodes and deleting things and doing all kinds of stuff, but it does create a backup of your materials that are in the blend file. So this button just automatically deletes all the materials SimpleBake created and restores your original ones. Not sure there's an easy way to kind of illustrate that unless I forced it to crash, which is more trouble than it's worth. But basically, yeah, it'll delete every material that SimpleBake's created and restore everything from backups that it creates itself. This just gets rid of every image SimpleBake has created, this being one of them. So if I click this, it's gone. It just deletes every image that SimpleBake created. Obviously, if SimpleBake didn't create it, it leaves it intact. And then this deletes every object that SimpleBake's created. The only objects SimpleBake really creates are that cage object, if you remember the automatic cage object. So that's an object that SimpleBake creates. And also the copy and apply object, if you remember that. Copy objects and apply bakes. It duplicates your object and applies the bakes. But this will just get rid of every object that SimpleBake's created. And this is just a little utility with a find and replace. So you can search through images, objects, and materials and replace it. It does support basic wildcards, but they're a bit hard to understand. They're not quite like wildcards in Microsoft Word or anything. So if I do wildcard BE, so I'm trying to target that cube object, and then I need to set so it'll match CUBE basically because it's anything followed by BE, and then I might want to change it to sphere, find and replace. Oh no, I've not changed it to objects. Find and replace, and you see it's renamed cube to sphere. You can limit it to SimpleBake created objects, images, or materials, or you can have it operate on everything in your scene. It's just a little handy, hopefully handy utility. And that's it for that one. Okay, so let's talk about background baking. So there's two ways in which you can bake in SimpleBake. You can bake in the foreground, which is mostly what we've seen, and to be honest, mostly what I'd recommend. But you can also bake in the background. And what baking in the background does is it fires up another instance of Blender that you can't see, and that does the baking. And then you import the results back into your regular version of Blender. Also, if you've got options turned on to export to the external file system, so if you're exporting your bakes or you're exporting your mesh, it will still do that in the background. So I'll show a quick example of that really quickly. So let's bake, I don't know, these three. I've not edited them, so there'll be blank textures basically, but it'll show you what I mean. Yeah, let's export it. Why not? Let's export them both. I'm just going to go to where it's going to create those and get rid of it. So you see we've now got a blank SimpleBake_bakes directory. We'll leave it everything else as is, and I'm just going to bake in the background. So I can give each background operation a name. So we'll just give it a name, and away it goes. And you can see it's queued for a couple of seconds, and then it will become active, and then it will bake. It's already finished. So this doesn't update instantly, and this actually completed so quickly that we skipped active and went straight to complete. So you'll see that because I had the export options on, it's created the images and the FBX in the file system like it should have done. Nothing in Blender yet because it all happened in the background. But if I do want that stuff in the foreground, I can click here to import it. It's imported 3 images and 0 objects. 0 objects because we didn't turn on this copy objects and apply bakes option, so it only created textures. But now those textures exist here as well, if I wanted to use them. I think that's about it really. You can also, if you can cancel something midway and it'll attempt to kill the background process. There you go, that's a little more obvious what it's doing. But also if you decide when it's finished that you don't want the result, you can just click here and it just cleans up in the background basically. If you've exported your files, it won't delete them or anything, see that they're still here. It just cleans up and gets rid of the thing from your list, the background task from your list, and it deletes the temporary files and stuff in the background that it was using to do that. And that's background baking really. Oh, it's probably worth mentioning not everything is available in the background just because of limitations on what I can do. So again, going back to node groups being such a pain in the arse, I can't ungroup node groups in the background because, well, I'm not going to explain why, but it's just really annoying. So if you try to bake something, it says no groups detected. Unfortunately, these can only be baked in the foreground. So I'd have to manually remove the no groups if I could do it. There's a couple of other things that don't work in the background, like image sequence. Image sequence can't be baked in the background. And again, it's just annoying kind of limitations in the Blender API that I can't at the moment find a way around. I mean, background is useful, but I do most of my baking in the foreground, to be honest. It's useful to be able to fire off several background bakes, and you can fire them off and they will queue up like this, and then they will just gradually progress from active to completed one by one. So if that in that way, you could kind of queue up a bunch of bakes if you wanted them. But yeah, if it's useful to you, use it. Just beware, like I say, there's limitations on what it can do. Okay, I think we're finally into CyclesBake. So this is the more, let's reset all the settings, shall we, using that button. This is as I've said before, it shares a lot of the same options with PBR Bake, and I'm not going to go over them again, but it's the traditional way Blender bakes. So if you set your engine to cycles, because Blender only allows baking in cycles, and you were baking here, it's basically this, but with the convenience of SimpleBake, creating your textures, creating your bake texture nodes, setting all your settings. It's this, but with all the hassle taken out of it. So you'll notice that if you've ever done kind of normal baking in Blender, you'll notice the options are basically the same. So if I add a bake object, like I'm going to bake this cube, this is the main difference. You can select these modes of baking, which are the same as the ones you get in there. You can turn off, so combined is, I'm not going to go into every mode in which Blender can bake, but CyclesBake in general is taking into account lighting and shadows, and you can turn off different elements of that to get the exact texture you want. And then you've got these other bake modes like AO and glossy and diffuse, and if you know what you're doing, and these are all documented in Blender's documentation as to what these are. But this is the kind of the old-fashioned, the traditional way, the non-PBR way that Blender offers texture baking. Sample count is pretty obvious because unlike PBR, sample count is extremely important for CyclesBake because you're dealing with light and shadow and that gives noise. Color space is just this option again that you'll recognize from the add-on preferences when we were setting it for the different types of PBR bake. But this is just the color space which your image will be created with. So if I quickly bake this, I get this, and then you'll see it's created with whatever color space I selected. So non-color, oh no, we're looking at the wrong thing. We're looking at the PBR texture, CyclesBake. So it's been created with sRGB because that's what we had selected. So hopefully that makes sense. We talked about denoising, so I won't go into it again, but it's exactly the same as when we talked about it in PBR. You can't use the compositor because I'm not exporting my bakes, but again, we talked about this in the PBR section, so flick back to that. We talked about it for PBR when we were talking about light maps, because on the PBR side of things, this denoise stuff appears here because it's not relevant to the main PBR textures, it's relevant to light map. CyclesBake is relevant to everything, so it appears here in this main part of the panel, but it will also apply to these as well. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't think there's anything else to cover there. I think that's it. That's the main kind of section of the CyclesBake panel. I'll just pause the video while I think about if anything else is different. So I think everything else is pretty much the same. You've got the same set of options for UVs, the same set of options for textures, multiple objects to one texture set is the same. It's very similar because it's really just the type of bake you're doing. I guess the only thing that's worth pointing out is that when you copy objects and apply bakes, you've got this option about what your material is based around. So there's no kind of right and wrong way to create materials for CyclesBake. They can either be fed into an emission node, fed into the principal BSDF node, or background, so fed into a background node. If you know what you're doing, you'll know which one you want, but I think most of the time you'll want to feed it into an emission node. And the reason for that is that that will then, so just looking at this material, see how it's created it going into a background node. The reason is that when you're baking with CyclesBake, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but you're baking all the light and all the shadows into the texture. It's like you've taken a picture of the surface. So you don't really want to display that on your model in a way that adds more shadows and light because you've already baked in the shadows and light that you want. So what you tend to do is you tend to display it with an emission node set to 1, set to a strength of 1. And that basically says, it's not going to accept any more light or shadow from any other objects because emission surfaces aren't affected by light or shadow. And it just displays it as like a photo of the original material with the original lights and shadows. So that's why I think most of the time you'll just want it fed through an emission node at strength 1. People who are more clever than me may want different options. If you're wondering what's going on here, it's telling me that the object I want to bake is hidden in the viewport because I told it to copy and apply, bake and hide. I could have SimpleBake just turn that back on, but I'm constantly trying to not make SimpleBake do things without telling you because I hate when add-ons just do, or computer programs in general just do things, and I want to know what it's doing and why. So everything SimpleBake does, it's constantly trying to tell you. So that's why it behaves like that. But yeah, I think that most of the time you'll want to run textures through an emission node, and that's sort of why that's the default. Other than that little difference and the main bit, the CyclesBake panel that we talked about, everything else works the same, in honesty. I kind of thought I was going to have to spend more time on this section, but I've just flicked through and it's all pretty much the same. So I think we can probably leave it there. Okay, I've saved the most complicated bit for last. I've also had about 3 goes at recording this so far. I don't know why this bit's so hard to explain, but okay, let's try again. Let's take this nice and slow. So I'm going to talk about baking to target. So there's different terminology here to think about. People often talk about baking high to low because normally, well, typically, you have a high poly object and you're trying to bake it to a low poly object. Not always, but a lot of the time, that's why you're doing this. The other terminology is source to target, or even Blender calls it baking selected to active. But it's all the same thing. You've basically got an object with materials and you want to capture the details of those materials and transfer them to another object, your target object, your low poly object, or your active object, as Blender calls it. SimpleBake, we call it a target object, or I call it a target object. So we'll start by looking at the simplest case first. So I'm going to create myself a source object, the object with the details we want to capture. Let's use our favorite magic texture again. And we'll maybe make this slightly more complicated than normal. So I'm going to subdivide it a couple of times maybe. I'm going to add a displacement modifier with basic, yeah, something like that. I'm gonna subdivide it again just so it's smooth. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so we'll have that as our high poly object, and I've given it this magic texture as our shading, and that's our object that we want to capture. So now I'm going to add a source object, which should be a a target object, which should be a kind of rougher version, often a lower poly version of that object. So let's simulate that. I'm going to duplicate that object and then let's, I don't know, decimate it. No, I tell you what, we're not going to get a good result by doing that because I won't be able to give it a good UV map. Let's do something different. Let's just add a cube and let's subdivide it a few times and let's leave it at that. So we still have the ability to give that a half decent UV map. That'll do. I mean, it'll have some stretching because that's not the shape anymore, but that'll do. And we'll have that as our kind of low poly object, maybe make it a bit bigger. So there you go. So we're trying to bake the detail of our high poly object onto our low poly object, or our source object to our target object. So I'm going to add our source object to here, and you could have more than one. So in the simplest mode, you can have multiple objects in here, and you might be baking them all down to one target. Let's give them names so I don't confuse them. So we'll call that source, which is again source, high poly, whatever, and we'll call that target, and we'll set that as our target. Now, I'm not going to change any other options. Let's just see what kind of result we get from that. So it's not too bad. You can see areas here. I think that's and there as well, where I think this has breached. You see that the low poly object doesn't completely encompass the high poly object. So the way I think about this, and I think this is correct, but I'm not an expert in this area at all, is that what Blender's doing is that it's firing rays out from the target object and trying to intersect the source object. So firing rays out from the low poly object to try and intersect the high poly object. And what you can do is you can play with these settings. So we'll talk about cage objects in a second, but if you don't specify a cage object, Blender's going to kind of almost sort of say, well, fine, I'm going to create my own. And it's going to create this automatic cage, if you like, defined by your cage extrusion value and your ray distance value. I'm not going to try and explain those because, again, I'm not an expert on them, but you see that these settings are pulled in from Blender. So these pop-ups, well, this one isn't, sorry, this one isn't, this one is. But the pop-ups sort of give you a flavor of what they are. So the cage extrusion is how far the automatically generated cage is extruded, and the ray distance is how far Blender's going to fire those rays before it gives up and says there's nothing there. It's really fiddly, in honesty. I've used other applications to bake from one object to another, and I just find Blender's approach to it fiddly, really fiddly, or maybe I just don't know what I'm doing. Probably true. But you can fiddle with those values. This is a SimpleBake specific value that is just a multiplier of both of those, and that was suggested by a kind SimpleBake viewer. It's not a TV show. That was suggested by a kind SimpleBake user as a good way of kind of easily dialing in those two values rather than having to change them both independently. You can kind of just change them with a single multiplier, and it is handy, to be fair. This was also suggested by a SimpleBake viewer user, and this is kind of they were kind enough to explain to me that the different options you have enabled in Blender's default settings for baking selected to active control how it processes the automatic cage, whether it's smooth or whether it's hard. It's quite complicated, but it does make a noticeable difference. So I implemented it in SimpleBake, and this is just a convenient way to switch between those two options. Having said all of that, it is by far better to use a cage object. A cage object is basically a inflated version of your target object or your low poly object. And the way I think about it, or the way it's been explained to me, is that instead of firing rays out from the target object or the low poly object and trying to get them to intersect the high poly object, it fires rays inwards from the cage. So the rays get fired from the cage, pass through the object, the source object, the high poly object, the object that you're trying to capture the details from, and then they travel inwards to the target object. Is that correct? I don't know, but that's how it was explained to me, and that's how it seems to work. So that's how I think about it. In the latest versions of SimpleBake, we've made this easier, or I've made this easier by adding this option to automatically generate a cage object. So when you click this, you'll see that it's taken my target object and it's created a kind of low poly version of it, or a simplified version of it, and then I can expand or contract that. So what you want to do is tune this so that your cage is encompassing all of your high poly objects. So it's quite fiddly, isn't it? Don't know if I can change that, but if I adjust the value manually, no, still popping out. So let's add another 2 to that. No, still 5 to that. Okay, so that's now encompassing everything without going too far. I mean, this isn't a great example because your target object should match your source object, or your low poly object should match your high poly object a little better than I've got here. But let's see what result we get. So we don't need to worry as much about these. So this is just left as unlimited. This isn't even relevant because we're using our own cage. So let's see what we get. Okay, so it's more or less, oh, it's actually a lot better. So here where we had those artifacts, those hard lines, we don't have them anymore. I mean, a better way of showing this might actually be, thinking about it, if we bake a normal map, does that show? So I'm going to just remember 0.15 is what we had for that cage. So I'm just going to bake it again. And let's just check this normal map. Yeah, you can see where it's breaching the surface and you get these weird anomalies. Now, let's see. You think I would have tested this, wouldn't you? But we're going to find out together. Does this look better? It does. It does look better. Okay, that's good. I'd have to re-record this again. So that, see, the cage object has given a much better result, and we've captured the normals of that object. The reason it's faceted like this is because it takes into account the normals of your low poly object as well. You probably want to deal with that, smooth them out. But you can see that it's captured the detail of the high poly object onto the low poly object much better with that automatic cage. So yeah, that works really well actually. So that's all the simplest way of baking selected to active, or source to target, or high to low, or whatever it is you want to call it. The only other thing I'll mention, should I mention? No, let's go on to the other methods. I just need to remember to come back to this isolate objects option. So I'm going to move on to auto match high to low, which is a different method. So in the method we've just been discussing, standard, this is baking everything in this list to a single low poly or target object. In this mode, this is for when you might have lots of pairs in your scene of usually high poly and low poly objects, and you want to bake them all and you don't want to do it one at a time. So this automatically matches high poly objects with low poly objects. So you add your high poly objects to the list. You see there's no option to manually specify a low poly object because it's trying to automatically detect them. At the moment, it's trying to automatically detect them by position. So you'll see at the moment it's found the object called source, and it thinks it's going to bake it to target because it's, they've got the same origin basically. If I move target away, if I move target away, why are you doing that? Oh, it's because the cage is left behind. Right, hold on. Let's get rid of all SimpleBake created objects. So if I move target away, it can no longer find the object it wants to bake to because it's basing it on position and it's too far away. It has to be back there again, and now it's found it again. The other way of matching them is is by name. So here, if I switch to name, it's cleared the list because as explained in the tooltip, only objects with underscore high as a suffix to their name can be added to the list. Each object's icon indicates corresponding match. So for this depends, we'd have to rename our objects. So we couldn't say source, we'd have to say something like, I don't know, cube high, and then I can add it to the list. And then it's looking for a target by name. This has to be cube low. And the high and low aren't case sensitive, but they do have to be high and low. And now, regardless of its position, it's going to try and bake to that. Obviously, this is going to be nonsense because they still have to share the same space, but it's not relying on the position anymore. It's using the name. And then all that will do is it will go through and bake them one by one. So we've only got one match in our list, but it's going to go through and bake them one by one if you've got more than one match. It's detected UDIMs, which must mean that our UV map has strayed into that tile slightly. But yeah, well, we won't worry about that for now. But that's how that works. So you get these auto match things, and it'll bake. So it's baked diffuse and normal because they're the ones we selected. If I had two pairs, I'll just show that really quickly. So we'll duplicate both these objects. We'll call this one cube, we'll call this one cube 2 high, and we'll call this one cube 2 low, and we'll add cube 2 high to our list. Let's see if we can quickly fix that UV map problem. It's just straying over the line, so it thinks it's UDIMs. So we could either scale the UVs or I could turn off this auto detect UDIMs option, but I'll just scale the UVs because it's quicker. So now I'll click it and it's going to do both of those objects. It's going to find them both. It's going to do one, diffuse, normal, then diffuse, normal, and then you see we get left with both two textures for the two different objects. The final mode is decals. I'm going to pause the video for a second because I will open a file I've prepared specifically to demonstrate that. So I'm recording this after I recorded the original bit of the video about baking to target because I said I needed to come back to mention the isolate objects option, and I absolutely didn't. So really simple. The isolate objects option is most relevant for CyclesBake when, again, you're talking about baking, objects get baked, taking into account light and shadow and things like that. Less relevant for PBR because it's all just baked as emission. There's no light, there's no shadow baked into the texture, so they can't really interfere with each other. I still have the option available here because I think it can make a difference in some circumstances, and I think especially if you're baking like a light map in PBR mode, it will affect, as we discussed when we were talking about special bakes. Light maps are basically a CyclesBake because that's how they work, so it's more relevant there, but it's most relevant here in CyclesBake. So if I was baking this cube, for example, I might if I was making this cube, and let's have it normal combined, and let's just quickly turn it to GPU, and let's just quickly bake that and see what we get. So you can see that there's a big chunk missing from here because that's where this object, this other cube, is obscuring this cube. So the light source coming from, well, that's the only lamp in the scene, so I guess all the light's coming from there, is being obscured. So now, if I turn on the isolate objects from each other, it should hide this object from rendering, so it doesn't affect any rendering, including texture baking. And we should see that the other object is baked without that object obscuring it. There we go. Sometimes you have to zoom in and zoom out a bit for the image to refresh, by the way, if you're wondering why it still looked wrong for a second there. But yeah, that's the texture we get. So it's just isolated that object. So the classic example of this that I like to use is you're baking a character model and you've modeled like a belt or gloves, but you want to bake the textures of their body or their like underlying clothes without the effect of the belt or the gloves or whatever it is. So instead of having to manually hide them, delete them, or take them out of the scene, you can tell SimpleBake to isolate the objects from each other, and therefore the gloves and the belt won't interfere with the texture baking for the body. If you're using the bake to target mode, this functions slightly differently. It's explained in the tooltip. When baking to target, this hides the influence of all objects except those in your bake objects list. So if you're baking some objects to target, so you've got a list here, but you have other objects in your scene that you don't have in this list and you don't want them to affect the baking to target that you're doing, then this functions to hide them. So it won't hide anything in this list, and only these will influence your target object. It works slightly different again in the auto match mode, because then what this will do is that it will basically hide everything in the scene except for your pair of high to low, which is it's basically what you'd expect if I wasn't explaining it to you. It's hiding the influence of objects other than what you'd naturally expect. So I think in this mode where you're pairing objects, you'd expect only those two objects to be relevant. So you'd expect everything else to be hidden, which it is. That's how it works. And when you're doing this kind of standard baking to target, it's going to hide everything that you've not specifically said, I want this in to influence the bake and put it in this list. And that's basically how that option works. Okay, so this is a file I've prepared specifically to illustrate the process of baking decals. This exists as its own separate mode in SimpleBake just because it's quite a common thing that people want to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reset all the SimpleBake settings so I can show you how to set it up. And I'm going to show you what we've got here. So what we have here is a cube. This is an object. That's weird. So these are decal. Let's start with these. These are planes with transparency, so you can see that they are what you would typically understand to be a decal. They're stuck to the surface of this cube with modifiers, shrink wrap modifiers. You don't really need to do that, but I think it's the easiest way of making sure that they stick to the cube. And the cube is just a cube with that magic texture that I love so much applied to it for testing purposes. Now, these are obviously three separate objects, each with their own texture. What I really want is to create a texture, or to create a material rather, that is just a single object or a single material and properly displays those decals. So again, it's a really common use case in SimpleBake, and this is how you would do it. So you start by adding the bake objects that you want are the decals. So we add decal 1 and decal 2. And then we turn on bake to target and set this to decals mode, decals to target. So decals to target. And then the target I'm going to choose as the cube. We won't bother with the cage object because, as I say, I've used modifiers to stick these things to the surface of this cube, so it's very unlikely that we'll get any problems with ray distance and things like that. So we'll just leave it there. We won't use a cage object, and I'll just leave these extrusion settings at default, and I'm hoping they will be okay. So the other thing we need to consider is what we're baking. We don't have a choice in alpha because decals almost always have alpha, so you do always want to bake alpha, so I can't even turn that off. But the rest of it depends on what channels both your decals and your target object are using, because they're all going to be in the end result. So the new function here to auto detect should be smart enough to pick that up. So it's picked up metalness, emission strength, and diffuse as the channels that this object should need. So it's going to bake all of those first for this, second for that, or maybe vice versa, and third for this. So the only other option we'll think about, we'll leave UV maps as is because I've already checked and the UV map for my target object looks good. Well, not good, it looks okay. And the only other option I'll turn on is copy objects and apply bakes because I want to show you the material that it creates for those decals. And so we'll just go, we'll bake. So now it's going to cycle through. It will take a little bit because, as I think I've mentioned previously in the video, Blender only lets you send one object to the bake engine at a time. I've got a couple of ideas on how to overcome that limitation in the future, but for PBR baking, it doesn't take that long anyway, because, like you say, like you can see, they're just pretty quick. And this is the end result. You'll see that it's hidden the original cube and the two decals and left us with this single object with the decals baked in. So let's look at the material. Looks pretty complicated, but this is how you should really display decals. So each of the channels we've baked, so let's look at diffuse because it's simple, consists of the diffuse from the underlying target object, so our cube, and then the decals, diffuse from the decals, and then an alpha that tells it, an alpha mask that tells it where to display the decals. So it will display the decals where it's white and not where it's black. And they are fed into the principal BSDF, same for metalness, same for emission strength. And then alpha is driving it all as, yeah, your alpha texture is just white really because you want to display the whole of the mixed texture. And then the normal map isn't actually being used because did we bake it? I can't even remember. No, we didn't even bake it. So it's not actually doing anything. So that's what you get. You can actually go even further if you want to. So depending on what, this might be all you need. This might be what you were looking for. This might be what you're using. But you could go even further if you really wanted to mash the textures together so there's no remnants of what's left, you could bake it again. So I can add cube baked to my list. Let's just auto detect again. And let's copy objects and apply bakes again. Oh yeah, sorry, no, we want to turn off bake to target because that's not appropriate for this one. And now what we'll get, hopefully, eventually, give it a second to compute those. There we go. So now what we've actually got is the textures properly mashed together. So where are we? God, there's too many now. Cube baked, PBR, diffuse. There you go. So it's actually created a single texture with the decals mashed into the all into one texture, basically flatten them all into one texture. So depending on what you need, you might want to bake it and then bake it again to reduce it all down. I might look at a way of having it do that all from the start eventually, but at the moment that's the workflow for that. So hopefully that covers decals. Okay, I think that's it. I had a click through the SimpleBake interface when I paused the video looking for anything I'd completely forgotten to cover. I couldn't see anything, but SimpleBake is ironically so complex at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if I've missed something. If you drop me a note, maybe on Discord, I'll try and make sure that I cover that in an upcoming video if I can. As I say, please come over to Discord especially if you need workflow advice from other SimpleBake users. If it's a bug or a problem where SimpleBake isn't working as it should, then contact me probably via Blender Market because I do formal support through the Blender Market inbox. I do also get a lot of workflow type inquiries, and if I can or if I have time, I do try and help people, but in honesty, there's so many, especially people who are new to Blender or new to baking and looking for that kind of help. I can't always really give it between developing SimpleBake and my actual life and job and stuff. It's difficult to find time always to reply to people looking for that help. So Discord is the best place for that because then at least there's a chance another user might be able to help you with workflow and basic understanding queries. But certainly if it's a bug, if it's a crash or if there's just something that's blatantly not working as it should, then drop me a message on Blender Market and I am very quick to patch bugs. If you can provide a blend file or steps to reproduce it, that's the ideal because it's very hard to fix something if I can't reproduce it on my machine, as I'm sure you will appreciate. But yeah, other than that, like I say, please feel free to come over to Discord. But other than that, thank you for your time. I hope this was useful. I'll try and do these more regularly um, if I can find the time, but I will try and do at least like a couple of updates a year or something to cover the big changes to SimpleBake, just so the tutorials I have up there don't go massively out of date. Thanks very much.